You gather a ton of data about your customer experience, and it provides great insights into how your program is performing over time. But how do you know if you're in the ballpark compared to other organizations?
And especially CX leaders, we live in this world, so we're thinking benchmarking a lot. And when we present, we often don't step back for a moment and say, what are we doing? What does this mean? Why are we here? And what is successful?
Let's look at the CX Conundrum of Benchmarking on this episode of the CX Leader Podcast.
The CX Leader Podcast is produced by Walker, an experience management firm that helps our clients accelerate their XM success. You can find out more at walkerinfo.com.
Hello, everyone. I'm Troy Powell, host of this episode of the CX Leader Podcast, and thank you for listening. It's never been a better time to be a CX leader, and we explore topics and themes to help leaders like you develop great programs and deliver amazing experiences for your customers. What are some of the more common challenges you encounter with your CX program? Have you noticed a particular problem among CX programs when you talk with fellow pros? Well, we're going to tackle some of those issues in a new series we're calling CX Conundrums, where we'll address common CX challenges and possible ways CX leaders can address them. For this inaugural episode, we're going to tackle a common conundrum that comes up often with our clients: benchmarking. To delve into this topic, we're joined by two seasoned CX professionals that have a great deal of experience in benchmarking and everything related to CX measurement and management. First is my colleague here at Walker, Sean Clayton. Sean has 20 plus years experience working with a wide range of companies on CX topics and has some experience working on the client side as well with these topics. My other guest is longtime friend James Bampos, whose background goes way back in leading CX initiatives at some top tech firms in the industry for quite a while, and now has switched over to more of a consulting role, so helping take all of that experience, as he puts it, the scars from those experiences as well, and bringing them to people who are leading their own programs and providing that advice and consulting that we all need to move our programs forward. So, Sean, James, welcome to the CX Leader Podcast.
Thanks, Troy.
Good to be here.
Excellent. So, one piece we definitely want to get into a lot of detail, and I think we also want to call out here, James, you worked recently on a B2B benchmarking report for Qualtrics that we've used pretty extensively with some clients recently, and has an interesting perspective. So I want you to be pulling some of that out as we move forward. But where I want to start us maybe is that all too familiar place that you both have been directly in, I know, but then also all of us have been involved secondarily in helping clients with this, where you are presenting some CX results to key stakeholders in your organization, and they see a score. The question is, well, is that good? Like, is that a good score? Should we be happy with that? How does it compare? Those questions inevitably come up. And so then the CX leader's in this position of, all right, well, how do I answer that? And I think traditionally what I've seen people have gone directly to, I need a benchmark to compare that score to say, yeah, we're good, or we're bad, or we need help. And that's definitely one answer, but I want us to obviously be thinking more holistically about that. So James, let's start with you. Like, that question, that situation, what are some ways you like to think about answering that question?
Yeah, I think we have to start with, what do we mean when we talk about benchmarking, right? I think there's a foundation that we often don't set. And especially CX leaders, we live in this world, right? So we're thinking benchmarking a lot. And when we present, we often don't step back for a moment and say, what are we doing? What does this mean? Why are we here? And what is success look like, right? So often when we start with benchmarking, are we talking about performance or process benchmarking, right? Two different components. Performance in terms of NPS, CSAT, process in terms of, for example, what's your average response rate to an email survey, right? And then we look at how we use it internally, externally. And I think when we present benchmarks, if we all understand what we're presenting and why, performance, for example, in this area of the business to reflect our performance against whom, right? And I think oftentimes, again, setting that stage of what we're presenting and why, and then finally, what are the expectations, right? What do you do with this? So what, right? So what?
I completely agree with the comments that James made. And it is a question that any person, any CX professional should expect to come up in a meeting or a presentation. And like I kind of step back and ask, why is that? Why should you expect it to come up? And I think the reason is, this is somewhat of an innate trait of humans, that we want to be able to compare ourselves to each other at the individual level. And like, why is that? Well, you mentioned it earlier, like we want to know, are we normal? are we doing okay? So there's something, this like self-definition idea around benchmarking that really is going to be prevalent in all walks of life. But in the CX world, and especially I think when we're in an executive setting for a presentation, the C-suite is very used to being able to compare themselves, particularly if they're publicly traded, to other companies on financial metrics, and have a natural expectation that that's going to be the same when they get introduced to a customer experience metric. I mean, they're out on the golf course comparing their golf swings to other CEOs. So I think it's a natural thing. And the challenge is that there are all kinds of pitfalls with benchmarking in a customer experience setting that make it incredibly difficult to get a true apples to apples comparison. From a financial metric standpoint, it's very easy to get that direct comparison. It's very hard data. CX is inherently soft data. So that's one of the challenges. I'm sure we'll talk about many more challenges.
No, but that is a very important one. I think this expectation of what a benchmark is for a CEO and for somebody in charge of an operational function, those things, versus what CX can produce from a benchmark standpoint, right? And so from other parts of the org, so let's think outside of CX, when somebody says benchmark, what are they maybe usually thinking of, or what are they used to seeing when a benchmark comes up as a topic?
Yeah, right along with what Sean said, my mind goes right to Fortune 500, right? How are CEOs comparing their performance, right? And they get called on what two things, profit and loss, right? So when you're talking in C-layer, you're talking Fortune 500. But in my experience, we've also worked with organizational leaders like head of customer support. Now, their benchmarking is very different. Average cost per call, average wait time, right? Very different set of benchmarks that are, again, aligned, as Sean said, to the business objectives. And I think if you point benchmarking in that way, and again, you frame it correctly, it becomes a standard by which people think about. They already know a benchmark. How are you introducing the concept of CX into their head of benchmarks?
Yeah, and it takes me back a little bit to your earlier comment on this kind of performance versus process, benchmarking, and in a lot of cases, those aren't as maybe different. Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, it may not be quite as different for somebody in like an operational standpoint, where yes, the performance of cost per call or average wait time or those things, like yes, it does vary. Like you can't just compare that to any other company in the world, but there's going to be companies like yours that you, in a lot of cases, will have some insight into, what is a good, metric there.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think the underlying kind of theme is with the concept of a benchmark is, as an organization, we aspire to be a leader, and we need some gauge of how far away we are from reaching that. So, it could be benchmarking manufacturing excellence, operational excellence, financial performance, but that's kind of the concept. And so it doesn't even necessarily mean that they're benchmarking within their industry. Like maybe we want to have the same manufacturing excellence as an organization in a totally different industry that's being held up as a leader. Or the other concept with benchmarking is it can be completely within the organization. We want to benchmark call center A to call center B, or business unit 1 to business unit 2. So it can be done internally as well, potentially with less of the cons that we might be talking about later than an external benchmark.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I think that's a really interesting point I was going to bring up later if it didn't come up before, but it has. So let's jump on that a little. So we do talk about on the CX side, and we'll get into some of those additional issues you have on the CX part, but this ability to have objective benchmarks can be really challenging. There's a ton of things that are going to affect scores, obviously, and even response rates and other things like that matter as to how you've set your program up, etc. So this idea of, or where do we go about to get benchmarks, which we'll talk more broadly about, but Sean brought up this idea of internal benchmarking as, so talk a little bit about the value maybe of that to CX, and then if there are some kind of cons to that internal benchmarking.
Yeah, I mean, so some of the pluses of doing the internal benchmark, one is obviously you have that data, whether it's CX or some other form of data, readily available. And so some of the downsides of external benchmarking just don't apply. You should have good data across the organization. That's still an assumption. Maybe you have wildly varying response rates, but you should be able to control that a little bit more. And I think critically what you're focused on is improving your own performance. You're not kind of chasing somebody else's scores. You are trying to improve. We're assuming that you have intent, you have goals, you have purpose all around customer experience. And this is one of the ways that you're trying to get the organization across product lines, business units, regions, whatever, all rowing in the same direction. And so it is a commonly used form of benchmarking for customer experience data. Some of the potential pitfalls, one big one, and I think it's just so tempting because that data is readily available, that this central CX organization is just going to start comparing things left, right, and center. But there has been, over the decades, a lot of research that suggests you should not compare scores, results across different countries and regions, because there is a phenomenon called cultural bias that will make those comparisons misleading. So that's one potential pitfall. You really need to benchmark within a region, ideally within a country, to avoid that. Then I think another pitfall, and this more on the business to consumer side of the house, is that you might be comparing apples and oranges, even if you're comparing different stores that you own or different hotels that you own, because there are environmental factors that make it maybe not fair to compare, for instance, one Courtyard Marriott that's just been built and it has all the latest and greatest features, USB-C chargers on the bedside, cabinets, the whole thing, to another Courtyard Marriott that was last renovated 20 years ago. They could be in the exact same state or even city. So I think those, you have to really make sure that we're not creating an unfair comparison because of those environmental factors. But that applies more on the consumer side. And then, of course, the cultural bias is another just thing we need to be aware of when doing these internal comparisons.
Important points, though. Again, that internal, external, international, right? Those have to be called out specifically because they will influence not only the results, but what actions the business will take. And there are multiple dimensions you have to encounter when you're looking at benchmarking in those areas. And again, as Sean pointed out, if you set a standard as to why you're doing it and what this reflects, much more chances of success rather than throwing a bunch of numbers up there and saying, this is where we should be. Yep. Which I've seen, by the way, right? You know, the the ultra compare. Matter of fact, I had an instance where I had an executive turn around his laptop and show me a competitor's NPS during the executive meeting and say, why aren't we this score? With no other relevance at all other than a marketing promo on someone's website. And there was my benchmark. Make that score. That was it. Right. End of benchmarking exercise.
Which is, you kind of, we laugh at it, but it's not too far off from what some stakeholders or even some CX leaders would think is the right piece. Like, hey,
but again, there was no relevance. There was no setup. There was nothing. It was, here's a number, go get that.
Well, that kind of leads into this piece. I often think about benchmark. Well, I often think about benchmarking, period, unfortunately. but when I think about it, this idea of, I think we use this term just generally, but the realities are there's, especially in CX, I think two sides to this. And one is very much more of a what I call a normative score comparison, which is really a little bit of what you were pointing to, James, even though that was specific. But this idea that, okay, well, let's get an average score in an industry or an average score worldwide, or it's just a comparison, a score to a score. And then we're like, hey, we're above that, we're below that, we're right at that. And so, yay, boo, great. There's some value to that, but really benchmarking, if you think about that as what it actually is intended to be, what it's defined as, it's the process of comparing your operations and processes against others, either within your industry or outside at times, to really learn about other practices and processes that you could take inside and improve your own processes. Like that, the idea of benchmarking is, yes, it's about a comparison, but it's really more about a comparison to a process or to something that you can do in order to improve what you're doing. It's like, how do we get better? So, with that in mind, like, as we think about then in CX, how do we think about this difference and getting people maybe starting at the normative score, but getting them to think about the improvement as being the key?
Yeah, what a concept in CX to take action, right? I mean, we laugh about it, but here is the real difference. And I love your norms versus benchmarking, right? Because that is really the difference when you cut right down to it, to a successful CX program. Companies that take action and show value to their customers and improve their bottom line and revenue are successful. The companies that compare themselves and look and go, yeah, that's interesting, and then don't understand what actions they need to take to drive that level of success. And you and Sean have both brought up two important points, which is, one, compare yourselves against people outside your industry. I know I've been in high tech forever, and God forbid we ever ask a question outside of high tech, because nobody's like us, quote unquote, which is nonsense, right? But then there's the also component of, what are we really doing this for? Is it just for to pat ourselves on the back because we're better than everyone, or are we doing it because we really just want to be the best and we're going to commit to action? So really important point.
Yeah, I think just the absence of what I would consider valid, reliable benchmark or normative data. I mean, both really is a huge challenge and a distraction for a lot of CX organizations within that company. But as James said, it's really, there is a role for benchmarking from a strategic and process level within CX. And, don't reinvent the wheel, but take a look. The very beginning of a CX initiative, we might recommend a maturity assessment. Well, the maturity assessment inherently has a comparison to more of a norm really than a benchmark. And that's a really good use of comparing yourself to others. You might want to benchmark, how do other companies my size structure their CX teams in terms of roles and responsibilities and headcount and so on? How do they go about actioning their CX insights and results? Now, that's logical, and that will lead to the business impact that James was talking about that has been widely proven over the years and decades. So if it's that obvious, why don't companies do it? Well, because it's not easy. It involves organizational change and investment and a focused strategy. What is easy is by finding an external benchmark and then comparing your very first round of CX survey results to that benchmark, and then going into a complete panic because the numbers don't look favorable for your company in front of the CEO and his direct reports. And there are 1,000 reasons why those numbers will never be comparable. So we somehow have to avoid that trap, because once you put the benchmarks up there, it's habitual. The CEO is going to expect them every single wave you have of new survey data. So it really is the responsibility of the CX practice within an organization to not overemphasize that need for benchmarking and comparisons at the very beginning, and to talk about where they will need to compare to what others are doing from a strategy, initiative, and process standpoint, but not from a score standpoint.
Sean, you just reminded me of something. You said something very valuable there about aligning expectations around benchmarking. One of the things that we did that we found very valuable is we became friends with the operational people within the business. And what are they benchmarking, right? So that when we present them benchmarks, it was now, again, on a relative level playing field, because CX was just another benchmark added to a list of benchmarks they were already familiar with, right? So that was super important. It helped the benchmarking communication be successful.
Yeah, and that's actually a really interesting and helpful perspective, because end of the day, especially when you're talking about the more functional interaction. So I think customer support, for instance, is a great one. Like at some level, what we want the CX data to be is almost this view of, okay, what we're achieving operationally is meeting customers' needs, right? Because that's the piece that they're always missing is, hey, we've got this great, average wait time and this really good cost per call and whatever. Well, but is that delivering the value customers want? And so if you view it that way, this view of, yes, like it is or it isn't, that becomes a valuable piece, and we're not exactly caring so much about how's that score compare. So thinking about CX less as its own metric that has to be benchmarked and more as a check act of our operations and processes achieving what they should. Are they providing the value to customers that they desire?
Bingo. That's it. That's it, Troy. That was exactly it. If you can answer that question through a benchmark and not get caught up in, quote, CX benchmark, then your future is much brighter, because now you have or a set of organizations committed to do something with the information they receive.
Well, let's bridge into, we mentioned a few times now, the issues that exist with comparing to some score, some CX, norm or benchmark from an external source and using that as a main comparison point. James and Sean, and we'll start with you, Sean, you'd kind of mentioned a few already, but what are some of these issues, problems with these scores, regardless of where you get them, that a CX leader should be aware of and pay attention to?
Yeah. One of the biggest is just the two sources of data you're typically comparing. So you're typically comparing your scores, your results from feedback that you collected from your customers who opened up an email or took the survey, however you sent it out, knowing that it was coming from you. You were clearly identified as the requester of that feedback. And that's great. That's perfect. That's why you would expect to get a good response rate, because people should be motivated to help you improve if they see improvements further down the road. The challenge with, I would say, the majority of the external CX benchmarks that exist is that they are collecting data in what's called a double-blind manner. So they do not identify who the survey is being sponsored by. And then they send the request out to what's called a panel. And a panel is basically a group of people that for some crazy reason have opted in to take surveys. So they do not know who sent them that survey request. And usually they're not just asked to evaluate one company or brand. They're going to evaluate multiple brands, vendors, companies in one survey sitting. And there are some data quality issues that people should be aware of if they're looking at that kind of data. It tends to, first of all, not be identifiable. So you'll never know who provided those responses that you're comparing yourself to in the boardroom. And you'll never really know how considerate they were as they were going through the survey in terms of thinking about the rating that they were provided. Not really incentivized because they don't know who's going to see the results to go through it very thoughtfully. In fact, the opposite is usually the case because they are incentivized in a monetary way to complete the survey. So speed, it's of the essence if you are a panelist. So all of that being said, there are significant pitfalls trying to take your NPS score that you got from your survey with your customers answering to any kind of external CX benchmark. And I would just say it is apples and oranges. It will never be apples to apples. Now, there are other ways. If you want to understand how your customers think about your competitors, you can actually ask them. That is another approach. And there's a school of thought that says in the CX industry that is actually in some ways more insightful than just asking them about your own product or service, particularly if it's an industry where multi-sourcing is prevalent, because nobody makes a decision in a vacuum. And there's a share of business that is going to you, but a share of business from your same customer that's going to somebody else. And so that same share or relative approach can be applied to customer experience and yield significantly more insights than just asking them to evaluate you. So that's getting deep into some methodological discussions that we probably don't have time for today. But just to say, there are ways to understand what your customers think of your competitors that don't involve using an external.
I 100% agree with Sean. Be aware of the pitfalls. Understand the data you are looking at and how it was collected, and again, how you're going to use it. One of the pitfalls I've seen also, and I think you both mentioned it, is this obsession with benchmarking at an executive level. They have to compare themselves somehow. And when CX is introduced, there's often a disregard of the validity of what they're looking at. And there's a lot of conclusions that come right away that are not accurate. So I think, again, setting up what are you looking at, what does this mean, is a really important part of this exercise, because otherwise you're going to be caught in that never-ending cycle of having to produce benchmarks that may not represent your business or the performance you're trying to obtain. So beware, as Sean said.
Okay, so this next question, I think, for James, and this might be one that would be good as maybe bonus content, perhaps, or something. But I do want to ask you, specifically about the B2B benchmark that you did at Qualtrics in that report, because I think, one, it did. There's always this piece of, hey, we're resistant to give scores and benchmarks. There's so many problems, but people still want them, and so this idea of, all right, well, let's do that. Let's do that in the best way kind of possible to get some comparison points, what you guys did. But I also really like what you did was looking at kind of the relationships, the areas for improvement, what drives, the outcomes, what's driving NPS, so this view that, okay, yes, scores, but really, again, benchmarking is, should be more about how do we improve and what are the things that matter. And so anyway, walk me just a little bit through kind of your mindset and the team's mindset as they were developing this benchmark, study and report.
Yeah, I think, we talk about controversial topics. I think 3 letters are no more controversial in this industry than NPS. But look, I think our purpose really was, one, to try to give a B2B companies a set of benchmarks that can compare themselves in a performance way, right? CSAT, NPS, willingness to continue to do business. What was interesting about the study is when we started to look at the results, while NPS and CSAT benchmarks were interesting, what we really wanted to do is what drove those scores. And so we looked at every area of the journey map, right? Operations, finance, product performance, support, renewals, sales, all of it. And then we looked at other considerations of drivers of NPS and CSAT. And what I thought the most interesting part of the report was the results of the drivers of those key indicators of performance. So in your sector, we did, I believe, 9 industries. In those sectors, what drove the performance of your business? In some sectors, it was renewals, had a very important impact on overall CSAT and NPS. In other industries, renewals had 0 impact, right? So it's interesting to see what industries should focus in what areas of the business and why. And then how do you compare to your competitors? So that was our mindset. It was, yes, we want benchmarks, but we really want, why do they matter? Why do those scores matter? And what can you do about it?
Yeah, and I think, that piece of what we compare to, I think, becomes important, right? So our internal score to an external benchmark isn't, like to Sean's point, isn't always the greatest. If you can get your score versus a competitor score in an objective manner, that becomes useful or valuable, but that's very costly and isn't really available in a lot of places. Okay, so we are getting short on time. There's still obviously a ton we could talk about on this topic, but I did want to make sure that we got to some take-home value for the listener. And there's really a lot of take-home value that's already been discussed. But if you had to maybe summarize, this down into 1 or 2 sort of statements of something a CX leader can really do and take from this on the topic of benchmark to help their programs and their companies, what would that be? So, Sean, let's hit you first.
Yeah, we've talked about this kind of throughout the conversation today, but I think in summary, what I would say is start by taking a look at yourself, look in the mirror, and before you compare to anybody else outside of your organization, think about how to improve your current position as it relates to customer experience. And when you do look at the role that comparisons to others can play, instead of focusing on their survey scores, focus on where you could compare yourself to what others are doing really well in terms of their overall CX strategy, initiatives, and processes related to that. That's what I would say is the best starting point. And as I mentioned before, if you start by positioning external benchmarks as critical to your CX program, it will be very difficult to back down from that position in the future. And it's not a position that we would recommend as far as that emphasis.
Yep, excellent advice. James, your take-home value.
Yeah, whether you're presenting benchmarking or any other kind of CX data, I always think of what I call the 3 stages of data brief. The first is your stakeholders will attack the data, then they'll attack the methodology, and then they'll attack you. And once you get through those 3 stages, then positioning, right, over-communicating, as Sean said, what are we looking at and why, is not a general comparison of performance, and that's how we should set the stage. It is a directed effort to establish a platform of comparison and to take action based on that to drive business improvement. And as we both said, ultimately, the goal is to produce the best experience possible to the customers in a thriving business.
Well, James and Sean, thank you so much for all of your wise and sage advice for our CX leaders on this topic. And if you want to talk about anything you heard on this podcast or about how Walker can help your business's customer experience, or you have a conundrum that you want us to tackle in future episodes, please email us at podcast@walkerinfo.com. Remember to give the CX Leader podcast a rating through your podcast service and give us a review. Your feedback will help us improve the show and deliver the best possible value to you, our listener. Check out our website, cxleaderpodcast.com, to subscribe to the show and find all our previous episodes, podcast series, and a link to our blog, which we update regularly. The CX Leader podcast is a production of Walker. We're an experience management firm that helps companies accelerate their XM success. You can read more about us at walkerinfo.com. Thank you for listening, and remember, it's a great time to be a CX leader. We'll see you next time.